All right, tonight we're down in Hebrews chapter 6 and starting in verse 7. Now, tonight's lesson is going to be pretty simple, but I want us to see how it really fits in. And we've talked about this a little bit before. This section that we're in began way back in chapter 5 and verse 10, where Paul introduced the idea that Jesus is a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And as soon as he made that statement, then he realized that that is a very deep subject, and now he is going to have to explain to them why it's going to take a little while to do this. So he goes off on what we call a parenthesis, a tangent. Now, I've got it here, and I want you to think here in this way. The subject of the high priesthood of Christ is brought up in chapter 4 and verse 14. That's where it starts. It ends in chapter 7 and verse 28. But there is a parenthesis in between from chapter 5, verse 11, down through the whole chapter of verse 6, down through verse 20. And has nothing to do with Melchizedek or Jesus being a high priest. So we say, well, what really does it have to do? It's on another subject. What he says is, he says, of which, that is the priesthood of Christ, we have many things to say that are hard of interpretation, seeing that you are dull of hearing. So he explains, it's hard for me to interpret, it's hard for me to explain it to you, because you people are dull of hearing. Over this 30-year period that you've been in the church, you haven't been studying, you haven't been really growing spiritually in that sense, and so you become dull of hearing, and so there is a real problem. Now, I want us to look at this parenthesis tonight, and let's see what it's all about. Here it is, starting in chapter 5, verse 11, and it's broken into three sections. The first section, chapter 5, 11 through 14, that's where he chastises them for dullness of hearing. And he rebukes them rather severely because of that dullness. Then, last week we studied chapter 6, 1 through 8, and there he gave them a severe warning about drifting away, showing them what dullness of hearing does. When you become dull of hearing, you're not studying the way you should, you start drifting away, and then he rebukes them seriously for doing that. Now tonight, we're going to be talking about chapter 6, starting in verse 9, and this is where he's going to be encouraging them by giving them assurance of hope and showing them that not all is lost. It's going to be positive material, where the last couple of weeks it has been negative material. So now, as we look at it, we look at that first part in there, and we can see how it all works together. First of all, let's look. I've taken this out. Here's what the scriptures talk about from Hebrews chapter 5, 10, named of God a high priest after the Melchizedek. Now all of this parenthesis, all of this that's black in there, that's what we've been talking about. That's the parenthesis. And look down at the end, chapter 7, for this Melchizedek, that's where he gets back on the subject. So what we could say is then that we remove that material, that parenthesis, and there it has a purpose of being in there. It's interjected in order to rebuke them for their lack of study. He said it makes it difficult for me to explain. Then he resumes again back in chapter 7 and in verse 1. Now tonight we're going to be talking about the latter part of that rebuke. Next week we'll start with chapter 7 and verse 1, and we'll get back on the story of Melchizedek. So I'm just trying to show us in various ways what that parenthesis is really all about in there. Now, first of all, we learned he chastised them for the dullness of hearing. Very quickly. He said, by reason of time you ought to be teachers. So he's rebuking them. You're not. What happens? You have need that someone teach you. So when it came time you ought to be a teacher, you have to have somebody to come in and teach you. Teach you what? Teach you just the very rudiments. Teach you the very ABCs of the first principles in here. It would be like if you're talking about reading. The first principle would be to try to say a word. Cat, Jane, dog, Now, that's your first principles. Now, what would be the rudiments? A, B, C. And so you have to learn them. He said, now that's the way it is of the oracles of God. We got to go back and study the very first things because you have become dull of hearing. So he shows those things are called milk, which babes need, but talking about the priesthood of Christ is like chewing on a steak, and we have to be full grown in order to do that. So that he chastised them for that. Then this last week, he gave them the severe warning about drifting away. He said, now you people who were once enlightened, and that now you've tasted the heavenly gift, you've experienced what being a mature Christian is all about. That's what all of these things say in there. You've done all of this. Now, when you have experienced that and you've tasted that, and then you fell away after that, it is impossible to renew you unto repentance. Now, that's where we stopped last week. We talked about there comes a time of when you keep drifting and you can't get back. There's a time in any realm. Over in Hawaii, there's a beach over there, and it has this riptide that goes out. And so people get in there, they get caught in this, and it starts taking them out toward Japan. And the people over there told me that they get helicopters and they found guys floating as far as 50 miles away from shore. And you can't swim against it. You're just drifting away. You're drifting away. Now, you can drift long ways. 50 miles out, they found guys. Would there be a breaking point? Would there be a period that if you're just drifting away from shore and it's caught you drifting away of where there's no hope and they're not going to get you? Yeah, see, I don't know where it'd be, 100 miles, 200, 500, out there somewhere. Why, it's impossible to get back in. And so you soon learn that when you're out there and you get caught in that thing, and it starts drifting you out, and you start swimming as hard as you can, and you can't swim against the tide. What are you going to do? There comes a time when it's impossible for you to swim in, see? And this is what he's saying. The same thing is true spiritually. We can drift away far enough to where we always have good intentions of getting back, but where it's impossible to be able to do it. Now then, the warning is, therefore, don't drift away. That's what the book is all about. Okay, now here's where we pick up his instruction here for tonight. In verses 7 through 8, he gives an example of why you are just, God does away with you. You are no good at this time. For the land, he's going to talk about the land. He said the same thing is true with land. The land which has drunk the rain that cometh upon it, and bringeth forth herbs, meat for them, for whose sake it is tilled, receiveth blessings from God. So it's got lots of good farmland. And it's loved, it's tilled. Every year it brings forth blessings. But there are parts of it that beareth thorns and thistles, and it is rejected and nigh unto a curse, whose end is to be burned. Now you can go into any farmland that you want to. Our greatest farmlands are back in the Midwest. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of corn and beans back there. But everywhere you go, you look and you expect to see all of these tens of millions of acres. I don't know how many millions of acres there would be of corn and soybeans. But as you look out, guess what you see in every farm? Every one. Even as great as Steve's is that I've been bragging about. Guess what's on his farm? Some of that bad land. Some of that it doesn't make any difference. What you do, you're not going to grow any corn on. There's going to be thistles. There's going to be bushes, blackberries that comes up. And do we ever have that problem out here? Do we ever have a problem where there's blackberries and you can't get rid of them? And you do everything you can, even have a bulldozer to come in. Lots of times people do have a bulldozer to come in, and they bulldoze out all the blackberry vines, and what happens next year? It grows blackberries again. And so It's just, there's some land that he said is just fit to be burned. Now he said, that's the way it is with being a Christian. So what kind of land are we going to be? Are we going to be fruitful, or are we going to be this kind of land that is not fit really to be saved? So he gives that example. Now then, the third part, and that's the part that we deal with tonight, that is encouraging them by giving them assurance of hope. So now here he spent this time rebuking them severely. They must have been terribly embarrassed. After they should have been Christians over 30 years, he says, you're just a bunch of babies. In fact, you are so childish that we have to go back and teach you the A, B's, and C's, you see, in doing these things. So he's really, really rebuking them. Now then, he's going to tell them, but it's not too late. What I want you to do is come back. What I want you to do is change your life. So that's what this is all about. So now, he says, but beloved, we are persuaded better things of you. Now, better things than these things that I just been talking about, of where you have no hope, you cannot change. It's time just to go ahead and burn you up. We're concerned of better things. Now, what is that? What is that key word that we said in the book of Hebrews that's used over and over and over and over again? Better. Here's where it is used again. Now, we're persuaded of better things. He's always showing two sides of these things. And things that accompany salvation. Now, he said the things that I am concerned about, the things that I am persuaded are better about you, are things that have to do with salvation. I'm not talking about your jobs. I'm not talking about your riches. I'm not talking about anything of that nature, he says. I'm talking about, I am persuaded you have great things as far as salvation is concerned. So he hasn't marked them off. He hasn't said that you people are all mixed up on these things and therefore you're lost. He still considers them children of God. So he said, I'm persuaded better things of you, things that accompany salvation, though we thus speak. Now, though we thus speak means, even though I have talked to you like a bunch of babies, even though I have embarrassed you, even though I have said these things about you that are just terrible, I am persuaded of better things, even though I have talked that way. Hey, it's starting to rain up there, huh? Now, he said, I'm persuaded of these things, but he understands why he is talking this way. He knows that he's embarrassing them. He intends to embarrass them because he wants to pull them out of this lethargy that they're in, so try to make better Christians out of them. Then he says, for God is not unrighteous to forget your work and the love which you showed toward his name, in that you ministered unto the saints and still do minister. Now here, he's really bragging on them. Whereas he had embarrassed them, called them a bunch of babies that you have to go back and teach the ABCs. Now then he says, but there's something that you have really excelled in. You have been a failure in your studying. You've been a failure in your growing in that realm. But you have been a real success in ministering unto the saints. Now this is one of the great things that the church did in the New Testament times, and it's a great thing that the church has to do today, and people do. That is ministering unto the saints, helping the needy, helping those who are really in need. Nowhere in the Bible does God encumber the church with taking care of the needy of the whole world. Now, he tells us on an individual basis that as you have opportunity, do good unto all men. But as far as the church is concerned, the church, he didn't burden the church down and say, now, as far as you have opportunity, want you to help all the needy of the world. How could that be accomplished? See? It would be an impossibility. He has said over and over in the book of Acts that the church is to take care of its own needy. To take care of its own needy. Now, unless you think that sounds cold, this is true in every realm. If you call up the Heart Association or the Cancer Society tomorrow, and you say, you know, I can't pay my utility bills this month. And, you know, I need $500, and I know that you are a good bunch of people. Would you pay my utility bills? What will they tell you? They'll say no. Well, I thought you helped the needy. We do. But our rules and regulations say we help the needy in their heart problems. And the other ones say in the cancer problems. Now the Lord said, you're to help needy saints. How long was the church established before they had needy saints? It was established in chapter 2. When do you run across that massive ministration of where you had to help them? Chapter 6, right away. See, right away. They had so many of those widows that needed help. And so they had to do that. And from there on, you find that there were needy saints, and they helped them. And that's what we need to do. Now he's bragging on them. Now he says, even though I have rebuked you about your spiritual growth, I want you to know God is not an unrighteous God to just forget what you have done. You have done some very great things. What do you do? Well, your work and your love. Your work and your love in what respect? In ministering unto the saints, you have done that, and you're still doing it. And so he compliments them in doing that. Now, by the way, this word minister is the word for deacon. That in that you have deaconed unto the saints, and you still do deacon. What does the word deacon mean? We'll be preaching on it here in a couple of weeks. What does the word mean? Serve. Right? It means a servant. That's what it really means. So you've served and you've helped those saints. Now, when you help the saints, these people understood the importance of it. In Matthew chapter 25 and in verse 40, at the judgment day, we have a picture. Now, I suppose that we're going to be judged. Well, I know we're going to be judged on what we've done in the body. Paul tells us that, and so we'll be judged on everything. But one way here Jesus tells them the judgment is coming is, he said, now, there was a time, on the judgment day, he said, there was a time when you saw me hungry and you fed me. You saw me without clothes and you clothed me. You saw me thirsty and you gave me to drink. And they said, well, Lord, when did we see you do this? Because there are going to be people there that didn't even live while Christ lived. People like you and me. He said, inasmuch as you did it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you did it unto me. So when you helped the least important, valuable member of the church that belongs to Christ, he said you were doing it unto me. He calls the church his body. You were ministering unto me when you did that. Then he goes ahead and he said, now some of you, you saw me hungry and you didn't give me anything to eat. You saw me without clothes, you didn't give me any clothing. And they're going to say, Lord, when did we do that? Because certainly if we'd have seen you hungry, we'd have given you food. See? He said, insomuch as you did it not unto one of the least of these my brethren, you did it not unto me. So when you're helping Christians, you're helping Christ. He said, I consider that part of my body, and it's the same as helping me. You remember what he said in Acts 9? Jesus, Paul was on the road to Damascus. The Lord knocked him down with the light, and the Lord said, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Paul didn't know who he was talking to. Why did Jesus say, why persecutest thou me, when Paul had never persecuted Jesus? He had never seen Jesus. He had never touched Jesus. And Paul said, Jesus said, you're persecuting me. What was Paul persecuting? The church. He was persecuting the church. He had torn the church up down at Jerusalem, on his way up to Damascus to do the same thing. So we can begin to see what the Lord says then in that. This is really, really important for us to understand. In our everyday life, of how we treat our brethren, the peace that we should have in the church, of what we do with each other. It's not just Raleigh and me. If I looked at him and said, do I want to be his friend? I can't see any good thing about him. He got that beard on there and goes down to Redmond, got that easy job, making all that big money while I'm poor. I see all this stuff about Raleigh and phooey on Raleigh. Let's suppose I don't like Raleigh. Why should I treat him good and right? Because of Jesus Christ. He is part of the body of Christ. God didn't give us the option of deciding who we will do what with. He said, you've got to treat people right because of their relationship with Christ. This new class we've got. He gave an example which I think is just absolutely beautiful, and I want to give it to you. A little rag doll. And so he gave this example, and he says, now let's consider, he said, my little girl. He said back when she was just a little girl, she had a little doll named Holly Hoppy, I believe it was. He said every once in a while she'd come in and she'd give me the privilege of holding her doll. And she'd say, here, Dad, would you hold Holly Hoppy while I go make her bed? And he said, I looked at that little doll one day. I was holding her. She went in to make Holly Hoppy's bed. And I looked at that rag doll, and it was a mess. It was torn. It had an eye pulled off of it. It was dirty. It was filthy. You look at it, it was all ragged. It'd been dragged through. And he thought, it'd be much better if I just went to the store and bought her another one. This doll is absolutely worthless. I'd like to go get her another. But he said, do you know why I didn't go get her another doll? Do you know why I held that little, dirty, torn up doll? That little Holly Hoppy? Not because I liked her, because she's ugly, but because of what she meant to her owner. What she meant to my little girl that I love so much. And I kept that old doll, and she came back, and I gave her little Holly Hoppy. And I said, it shows you that how you treat people is not the value of what you see in them. That's not it. But what does their owner think of them? I think that's one of the most beautiful thoughts I've heard, and I don't know when. How do you treat your fellow man? I don't care what you think of them. What does their owner think of them? Isn't that awesome? What does their owner think of them? That's what it's talking about.
Is he talking about how we treat our fellow man or how we treat fellow Christians?
In Matthew 25, I think it's fellow Christians, because he said, one of the least of these my brethren, is what I would take there. Do you see something about?
Well, I see he says, one of the least of these my brethren. So I was just trying
That's the only evidence I have. And that's the reason I would say that's what he's talking about. Once you do this, you've done it unto me. And I don't see him saying that if it were heathens, atheists, and enemies. You see, they weren't part of him. But Christians are part of his body. So he said, you people have done that. And I want to compliment you for it. And so he gives them a great compliment in there. I love that little Holly Hoppy example. It touched my heart and brings tears to my eyes, really, to think about it. Then he gets down and he says, and we desire that each one of you may show the same diligence unto the fullness of hope, even unto the end. Now let's stop right there, and I've colored in these words for a purpose. We desire that each one of you may show the same diligence. What does the word diligent mean? Give me a good definition of diligent. You talk about a diligent person. What does it mean?
Hard worker.
Hard worker. That's right. Anybody else got anything to put in there?
Keeping going when it's tough.
Keep going when it's tough. Keep going how fast, Todd?
As fast as you need.
Try it again. I mean, that's right, but I'm trying to get diligence.
Full bore.
What?
Full bore.
Full bore. That's what I'm trying to get. The word diligence means exert energy. That's the idea. Work at it hard. The definition says exert energy. So we're in something now to really work at. Don't just play at. He said, I compliment you on it. And I want you now to give diligence. And you keep working. You keep going. Don't you slow up. What's the book of Hebrews about? What is he trying to correct them on? Sluggish, drifting, neglect. Right? And so he's encouraging them. Be diligent unto the fullness of hope. Fullness of hope. What's hope? Hope is composed of two things. What's the first part? A desire to have a certain thing, something, whatever it is. Second part, an expectation you're going to get it. See, I might desire to inherit Bill Gates' money. Do I have any hope of it? And if I said, I hope I inherit his money, you know what I'm talking about. What would you say I'm talking about? I would like to have it. I just use it, just half of the word is what it is. But if I really hope that I'm going to do it, I'd have to want it first, and then secondly, I would have to have a reason to expect that I would inherit it. Right? And my hope depends on that reason of expectation, doesn't it? So how much hope do you suppose I have of inheriting his money? Zero. See? I have zero because that expectation is not there. Now, you're going to have some expectation, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute here tonight. I want you now to give your full diligence, work as hard as you can unto the fullness of hope, the completeness of hope, until you have reached the hope, until you have acquired that hope. Don't give up. Now, Todd, we're back at yours. When do you stop? You just keep working, don't you? You just keep working. When you don't want to work, you just keep going. That's in there. So you just keep going. How far? Even unto the end. You go until the day you die. Now, we talk a lot about retirement. And it's a big thing in America, isn't it? And especially we've got, the baby boomers coming along, and it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. That word retirement is going to be there. When do you retire from serving Christ? Don't even think about it. Don't even consider it. There's no way to even think about. I'm so old now. I've reached this age, and now then I'll just turn it over and let somebody else do it. It's my turn. I've suffered enough. I've worked hard enough. I've made enough sacrifices. Now, let somebody else do it. When does that time come according to this verse? No, don't even think about it. Well, when you get aged and old, what are you supposed to do? Okay, be an example. What are you supposed to do here according to this? Just keep giving diligence. That's it. Exert energy. Work as hard as you can because you haven't died yet. See? Don't give up serving Christ until the end. Now, give that diligence that you be not sluggish. There's your solution. You say, well, how do I keep from just kind of falling backwards? And it's so hard to keep from falling back. Well, what's the solution here? What does that top line say right before that you be not sluggish? It tells you what the solution is. Be diligent. Be diligent to the end that you be not sluggish. Otherwise, you're going to be sluggish. And it doesn't make any difference what it's about. I bet you that right now I could say, I want to get some testimonies here. Outside of religion, I want you to talk to me about your hobbies. How many of you have ever started a hobby that you were really diligent about? You really thought, this is great, this is what I'm going to do. And after a while, you became sluggish. Let me see a hand. Any of you ever do that? You kind of went, boy, look at those hands that went up, see? Now, what happens when you started out this and then you became sluggish? What happened to your hobby? How many of you dropped your hobby? Raise your hand. Oh, just about the same number, right? That did that. So I'll find another one. See? And so I'm diligent. All I'm doing is I'm saying, this is just human nature. It's human nature. If you're a fish and you want to live, you're going to breathe underwater. If you're a mammal, you want to live, you're going to breathe air. If you're a Christian, you want to live, what are you going to do? You're going to be diligent. See? And if you're not, you're going to fall back. See? That you be not sluggish. How many of you need me to talk about 15 minutes about what a slug is because you've never seen a slug? All right. We all know what a slug is. It's just there. But here's an interesting thing about a slug. You look at him. What's your first impression when you see a slug? What's your first impression of a slug other than uck? I'm not talking about eating one. It's how fast they move, isn't it? See? It's, boy, they'll never get anywhere. How fast do you ever see your fastest slug go? Let's see. How many of you have ever seen that slug that just moves? It takes months to get across the walkway. And so you thought, well, I'm going to kill that slug because it's headed over to my flower bed. I'm going to kill it. But I'm going to go get something to kill it with. I'll go in and I'll do this, and in a minute I'll come back and I'll sprinkle some salt on it or I'll do something. So you go in. You have plenty of time, don't you, to kill that slug? So you go in, you do this, you do that, you have a little coffee. Okay, I'm going out and kill my slug. How many of you have experienced when you went out that slug is already gone? He's somewhere in your flower bed and you can't find him? Yeah, see? That's what happens. That's what he's telling us. Don't do that. Don't be sluggish because you get away from there. Then he says, but imitators of them who through faith and patience inherit the promises. Now, we're talking about imitators of them in that sense in there. It's talking about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and David and those people who have gone on before us. Let's imitate those people who have been diligent and they have already inherited the promises. They're already inheriting and enjoying the greatness of what Paul said, it would be better for me to die and go be with Christ, for it's very far better. So let's look at those guys. And let's then use them and imitate them. Now he's getting ready to pick out one guy. Guess who he's going to pick out? Abraham. He's going to talk now about Abraham. So he said, now here is what I'd like for us to see. So here it is, of inheriting the promise. Now verses 13 through 20 is this. They contain the argument for the assurances that the promise will be received. Now, if you have hope, let's go back to this. What's the two things for you to have hope? You're to be diligent unto the fullness of your hope. And to have hope, what is it? A desire and an expectation. And the more you expect something, the greater your hope is, isn't it? The more you expect it, the greater your hope is. Now, how great can our hope be? How great can it be? All right, these verses are going to contain the argument to show you how great your hope can be because of your expectation. He's going to use Abraham. He's going to use God's oath to the promise for assurance. He's going to say, now here's how much you can hope for it. Here's how much of a guarantee you got. And then he's going to say, first of all, you've got this guarantee because God promised it. Not a human being, but because God promised it. Let me ask you, have you ever had anybody promise you that they're going to do something, give you something or something, and they didn't do it? Why, certainly. You know that. How many salesmen have promised that, no, I want your product and I'll call you some of these days. I want this. How many salesmen had that to happen and then the person never shows up? Ask any salesman, how often does somebody show up when they give you a promise, I want that? If you go out to buy a house and a real estate salesman's there and the people said, yeah, we want this house. We want this house. And he said, well, okay. What does he pull out of his pocket? An earnest money agreement, a form for you to sign. And then he asks you to write out a check for a certain amount of money, which you are supposed to forfeit if you don't do that. Now, what happens if a person says, no, I don't want to sign that tonight, but I'll be back? What happens? They don't come back. They don't come back. So when you get a promise from somebody, you say, well, some people's word I would put a lot of stock in. Other people I wouldn't put any stock in. And of everybody, I wouldn't put all my stock in it. I wouldn't, because they might change their mind. So he's going to say, now this is God that promises you. So I want you to understand this. Then he's going to say, God wants you to know that it is so sure that you're going to inherit that he even swore that his promise was true. He took an oath that his promise was true, if you can believe that of God. So that's what this is going to be about. Drop that thing and got it all goofed up right in here, I see. Okay, now that's what this thing here is all going to be about. Then he's going to bring Jesus in, Jesus as the anchor of our hope. So now with that behind us, let us look now here at the Scripture. I think it's the best way to look at it. And I'm going to start going through from verse 13, and then we'll just kind of explain it here so that you've already seen here. For when God made promise to Abraham, he said, now Abraham's going to be the example. God made these promises to him, and that is that he was going through his seed, all nations of the earth would be blessed and so forth. Since he could swear by none greater, he swore by himself. So God gave a promise, and then God took an oath or swore that this promise is true. And he's going to make a point on that in a minute. He said, when he did it, God said, surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying will I multiply thee. Now we might think that's a funny way of saying this, but this is the way Hebrews said it when they wanted to put emphasis on there. What we would do is, we would say, I will bless you. We'd raise our voice. But what they would say, they would repeat. They generally put an infinitive in front of a verb, which is a duplication. But this is the way they said it there, and that is, blessing I will bless thee. If Greeks did the same thing, New Testament, and they say, if I'm going to say I'm going to kill you, but if I wanted to say I'm going to kill you, what they would say is, I'll kill you with death, or with death I'll kill you. Well, how else can you kill them? That's the only way. Why'd they say it? It's emphasis. So what God is saying is, I will bless you, and multiply you. And thus, having patiently endured, he obtained the promise. That's Abraham. Abraham obtained the promise. He stayed faithful. And by the way, where is Abraham now? Anybody have any idea where Abraham is? Any scripture that might give you some idea where Abraham is? He remained faithful, and where is he right now? When you die and the angels come, they escort you where? Into Abraham's bosom, into the paradise world. So he obtained the promise. He stayed faithful. How long did Abraham have to stay faithful in order to inherit the promise? What? Until death. And you look at all of that he gave here. God called him out 25 years. After he called him out, he still didn't have a child. But Abraham's faith didn't waver. Finally, God gave him a child. And then after God gave him a child, and a few years later, what did God tell him to do? Go sacrifice the child. And his faith didn't waver. And that's when God made this oath to Abraham in Genesis 22, where Abraham had taken the knife and getting ready to sacrifice his son, and then God made the oath to him about these promises. And then he went ahead and he remained faithful till he died, and he's up there where you and I want to go now. For men swear by the greater, and in every dispute of theirs the oath is final for confirmation. He's showing how important an oath is. Wherein God, being mindful to show more abundantly unto the heirs of the promise the immutability of his counsel, interposed with an oath. That's why I say it's just amazing. God wanted Abraham and you and me to know there is an inheritance and you're going to get it. You be diligent. You be faithful. You are going to get it. I, God, am promising it. And I, God, am going to do more than just promise it. I'm going to promise it, and then I'm going to take an oath that it will happen. So you'll really believe it. Boggles your mind, doesn't it? That God would care for us so much that he would do that. He said that by two immutable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we may have a strong encouragement. We have two things in which it is impossible for God to lie. God is truth. Whatever God speaks happens. It's impossible for God to lie. What would these two immutable things be? What's he talking about? What's the two things he's talking about? The promise and the oath. So we have these two immutable things. Means unchangeable things that can't be changed. So we can have this encouragement. We who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. For those of us who have fled, we're laying hold of the hope that is set before us, which we have as an anchor of the soul. Now, here it is, we've got this anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast. Now, he uses an analogy here of a boat that we've got in here. And here's the way I'd kind of draw a picture of this. God gave a promise. He swore by an oath that his promise was true. By these two immutable things, we can have a hope. We can have our hope. And then he goes ahead and he says, this hope now is our anchor. That's an anchor. Now, when you have a boat out on an ocean, and you don't want that boat to drift, how do you secure the boat? How do you keep it from drifting? By an anchor. And it depends on how strong that anchor is, isn't it? Now, up here, I've got a pretty big anchor in here. How sure is it that that boat is not going to drift tonight? You look at it and say, boy, that is a good one there. It's sure and steadfast. We've got us a great anchor that's there to keep us from drifting, that's out there. Then he goes ahead and says in here, which we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and entering into that which is within the veil, whether as a forerunner, Jesus entered in for us. So now then, he points out that Jesus is really our anchor. There it is. Your hope is attached to Jesus. It's sure and steadfast. If you want to know how much confidence you can have that you're going to be able to go to heaven, there it is. You're tied into it. It all depends on the anchor. Don't drift. Don't cut the rope. Don't do something so that your boat leaves. Stay tied. That's the whole point. Stay tied in here. Now then, I want you to notice right in here, though, in verse 19, he changes the picture. And he says, a hope both sure and steadfast, and entering into that which is within the veil, whether as a forerunner, Jesus. When it says entering in behind the veil, what's the picture? What are you talking about? In a Hebrew mind, it would be the temple, wouldn't it? It would be in the Holy of Holies, that you go back to where God is. Now what's the picture that I'm getting ready to put up? Here's the thing that it's talking about. We've already talked about it, but here it is, we had Jesus. Jesus, as our forerunner, has gone up into the heavens, and he's gone behind the veil. We can't see him right now, but he is our hope, and he is our anchor. Keep that line tied to Jesus. Don't ever give up. That's what Paul is saying. Jesus entered in for us, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So our anchor is tied onto Jesus, who is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek. If you want to take a peek at chapter 7, verse 1, you'll see what he's going to start out with. Now, we're back on the subject of the priesthood of Christ. Yeah.
In verse 11, I have a New American Standard. It says full assurance of hope, and you had fullness of hope.
Yeah.
Are those not the same thing?
Same thing. Full assurance is an excellent translation. Mm-hmm. Until you've got it complete, don't waver, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could you say that full assurance of hope or fullness of hope, could you put faith in that same sentence? They're tied together now.
A fullness, assurance of hope. You couldn't have full assurance of hope without having faith. It would be an impossibility. See? Because your full assurance comes from the anchor, comes from Jesus, and without your faith in him, you would have none. Mm-hmm. Right. And so you come back to this again of who do you believe? See, I mean, that's the whole point. That if you put faith in me and I tell you, then your hope is going to be based on something very small. Right? But you put your faith in what God says. He's promised, he swore with an oath, he's given you this, you can have it. Full assurance. Okay, our time's up, class.